The doors to the private ballroom swung open at the exact moment Arden Vale saw her daughter standing close to a man she did not recognize. The music did not stop, but the room did. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Arden was the founder and chief executive of Vale Dominion, a woman who had spent 22 years building an empire out of steel, silence, and control. She had planned this evening down to the smallest detail. The seating charts, the guest list, the exact minute the lights would dim for her opening toast. And none of it had prepared her for the sight waiting on the far side of the room. The man beside her daughter wore no watch worth mentioning, no tailored jacket, nothing that announced wealth or belonging. He looked like exactly what he was, a contract maintenance technician who happened to work 3 floors below the executive suite. Arden crossed the room the way she crossed boardrooms, each step measured, each breath controlled, her eyes fixed on the 2 figures standing far too close together near the far wall. Celeste Vale did not step back when her mother approached. She had inherited many things from Arden: the sharp jaw, the steady posture, the refusal to flinch under pressure, and in that moment she used all of it. The man beside her, Maddox Rowan, kept his hands loose at his sides and said nothing, though his eyes never left Arden's face. Whispers moved through the crowd like a current under still water. Someone near the bar leaned toward a companion and murmured a question about who exactly had let the help into the party. Arden ignored them. She stopped 3 feet from her daughter and asked the only question that mattered to her in that instant. Low and even meant only for the 2 of them, though the whole room strained to hear it. "What are you doing with him?" Arden asked. Celeste did not blink. "I am standing next to someone I trust," she said. The words landed harder than either of them expected, and for a moment Arden's composure cracked just enough for those closest to notice. She turned to Maddox and told him, without raising her voice, that he should leave the property immediately. A single dad with a maintenance badge had no business standing inside a room built for people who owned half the buildings in the city, and Arden made that clear without ever using those exact words. Maddox did not argue. He did not apologize either. He reached into a worn leather folder tucked under his arm and set it gently on the nearest table, the way a man sets down something heavier than it looks. "You can have me removed," Maddox said. "That is your right tonight. But before your security walks me out, you should read what is inside this folder." Arden stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for the arrogance she expected to find in a man trying to marry into money he had not earned. She did not find it. What she found instead was a stillness that unsettled her more than any argument could have. A member of her security team stepped forward at her side, waiting only for a nod to move Maddox toward the exit. Arden raised one hand slightly, and the man stopped where he stood. Guests near the bar leaned in closer, sensing that something had shifted, though none of them could have said exactly what. Celeste watched her mother's face with an intensity she rarely allowed herself in public, searching for any sign of the outcome to come. Against every instinct she had built over 2 decades of boardroom warfare, Arden reached for the folder and opened it, flipping past the first few pages with the practiced speed of someone who had read 1,000 contracts in her lifetime. 22 years of running a company had taught her to read a page in seconds, and this page did not need seconds. She turned to the last page and stopped breathing for a moment that felt much longer than it was. A signature sat at the bottom of an old document, one she had not seen in 19 years. One she had convinced herself she would never see again. Her hand, famous throughout the company for never trembling, trembled now. She closed the folder slowly, pressing it flat against the table, as though that alone could keep the past contained inside it. Celeste stepped closer, watching the color drain from her mother's face, unable to understand what had caused it. The room, still watching, still whispering, had no idea that the woman who controlled billions had just come face to face with a ghost she thought she buried a long time ago. 3 weeks before that night, Maddox Rowan had been nothing more than a name on a contractor's badge, one of dozens of technicians who moved through the lower floors of Vale Dominion's central facility, fixing what needed fixing and staying invisible while doing it. He had come out of a marriage that ended 2 years earlier, raising his young son on his own. working steady hours that let him make school pickups and dinner most nights. The divorce had been quiet, amicable in the way divorces rarely are, and Maddox had simply rebuilt his life around the one responsibility that mattered more to him than any career ever had. He rarely spoke about his past. He rarely spoke at all unless someone asked him something worth answering. His coworkers knew him as reliable, quiet, and unbothered by the executives who occasionally walked past without acknowledging his existence. He took the maintenance contract because it paid well and asked nothing of his pride. His son was 7 years old that year, still young enough to believe his father could fix anything with the right tools. And Maddox found a strange comfort in work that ended when a machine ran again, unlike the kind of work he used to do, where problems rarely stayed solved. What he had not expected was the growing list of small inconsistencies he noticed while working through the building's older financial servers, numbers that did not match reports, transfers logged under vague departmental codes, patterns that a man with his particular background could not ignore even if he tried. He said nothing to anyone. He simply began keeping notes, the same way he had once kept notes for a living, back when his job title had been very different from technician, back when boards of directors had once waited weeks just to hear his opinion on a balance sheet. Celeste noticed him before he ever noticed her. She had grown used to men either fawning over her name or resenting it. And Maddox did neither. She had spent years learning to read the small signals people gave off around wealth, the slight straightening of a spine, the sudden interest in whatever she happened to be talking about, and Maddox showed none of it the first time their paths crossed in a hallway. The first time they spoke, she watched a senior director humiliate him in front of a dozen employees over a delay that was not his fault. Maddox said nothing in his own defense. He simply knelt down, gathered the papers that had scattered across the floor, and told the director calmly that he might be wrong about many things, but the data itself did not lie. Something about the steadiness of that sentence stayed with Celeste long after she walked away. They began talking in small moments after that, a few minutes in a hallway, a conversation while waiting for an elevator that took too long. It was not romance at first. It was curiosity, then respect, then something neither of them named out loud. One afternoon she asked him why he never mentioned his son at work. And Maddox answered simply that some parts of his life were not for the building. Celeste found she respected the boundary more than she resented it. Celeste realized quickly that Maddox looked at her differently than everyone else in her orbit. He did not see the daughter of a billionaire. He saw a person, and that alone made him more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart than any wealthy suitor her mother had ever approved of. She began arriving early to the facility more often than her schedule required. She told herself it was curiosity about the maintenance reports, though everyone around her understood otherwise. Assistants who scheduled her calendar started quietly adjusting her mornings without ever being asked, and eventually stopped pretending they did not notice the pattern. Maddox never asked her why she kept showing up. He simply made room for her presence the way he made room for everything else in his life. Without comment, without expectation. One evening, waiting for him near the loading dock, Celeste searched his name out of simple curiosity, expecting nothing more than a maintenance license and a handful of old addresses. What she found instead confused her. There were gaps in his employment history that made no sense for a man his age. Years that seemed to have been scrubbed clean, references to a financial restructuring career that appeared and then vanished entirely from public record. A few old forum posts, buried deep in search results, mentioned his name alongside a company that no longer existed. Though the posts themselves had been edited so many times, they told her almost nothing useful. She did not confront him that night. She only watched him more carefully, aware for the first time that the quiet man beside her was carrying something far heavier than a toolbox. Celeste spent the following days digging deeper, piecing together fragments from old business journals and archived filings that had somehow survived deletion. She discovered that Maddox had once been a respected corporate turnaround specialist, a man brought in to save companies from collapse when no one else believed there was anything left to save. He had pulled one particular firm back from the edge of bankruptcy in a deal still referenced in industry circles, though rarely by his name. Colleagues from that era described him in old interview clippings as sharp, patient, and unwilling to compromise on the numbers no matter who stood to lose money because of them. Then, after one deal went catastrophically wrong, he disappeared from the profession entirely, and no one seemed willing to say exactly why. Even industry publications that once profiled him treated the disappearance as a minor footnote. A promising career simply cut short. When she finally asked him directly, sitting across from him at a small diner far from anywhere either of their worlds usually touched, Maddox set down his coffee and looked at her for a long moment before answering. "There are things I could tell you," he said, "but if I did, I would end up pulling a lot of people down with me, people who do not deserve what would happen to them." It was not an answer, and Celeste knew it was not an answer, and that only deepened her suspicion that whatever he was protecting mattered more than his own reputation. Meanwhile, reports of the relationship had already reached Arden through channels she trusted far more than her daughter's honesty. An assistant mentioned it first, almost casually, during a morning briefing about facility staff, and Arden's expression had not changed at all, though everyone in the room understood the comment had landed. She ordered a full background investigation into Maddox Rowan, expecting to find the usual pattern: debt, ambition, some hidden motive that would justify ending things before they went any further. Her security team returned with almost nothing. No significant debt, no criminal record, no public scandal of any kind. The strangest detail in the entire file was the deliberate simplicity of his life, a man who seemed to be living far below whatever level his skills and history should have placed him. He rented a modest 2-bedroom apartment near his son's school. He drove a car nearly a decade old, one that occasionally needed a jump start on cold mornings. He carried no significant savings, no property, nothing that suggested a man preparing to profit from proximity to wealth. Even his son's school records showed nothing unusual. Just a father who attended every parent conference and never once missed a pickup. Arden read the file twice, unsatisfied. A man does not hide his own competence without a reason, she told her chief of security. And she was right, though not in the way she assumed. She concluded that Maddox was playing a long game, positioning himself patiently to marry into money he could not otherwise access. It was a theory that fit neatly into everything she already believed about people who approached her family, and Arden had never been one to abandon a theory simply because the evidence beneath it felt thin. She called Celeste into her office that evening and delivered the warning she had given before to other men who circled her daughter, the warning she believed had always protected Celeste in the past. "A man who wants to walk into this family always wants something," Arden said, her voice flat and certain. Celeste did not back down. "Maybe you are the one measuring him by what you have," she answered, and left before her mother could respond. Arden sat alone in her office long after her daughter left, staring at nothing in particular, until an assistant brought her an old file pulled from deep archive at her request, a record of a transaction from nearly 2 decades earlier bearing the name Rowan, connected directly to a deal that had once cost Vale Dominion hundreds of millions of dollars. Arden decided the confrontation could not wait. She summoned Maddox to her private office. No assistants present, no witnesses, nothing but the two of them and the wide window overlooking the city she had spent her career reshaping. She had rehearsed the conversation in her mind more than once, certain that a man like Maddox would fold the moment real money entered the room. She slid a check across the desk toward him, the amount deliberately large enough to end any argument about money before it started. She told him plainly that if he accepted it and disappeared from her daughter's life, the matter would be finished and forgotten. Maddox looked at the check for a long moment. He did not reach for it. Instead, he pushed it gently back across the desk toward her. "I do not need your money," he said. Arden studied him, searching again for the greed she expected to find, and failing to find it a second time. "Then what do you need?" she asked. Maddox met her eyes without hesitation. "I just need you to stop deciding what a person is worth based on a bank account," he said. And the sentence landed harder than he probably intended. Arden opened her mouth to respond and found, for perhaps the first time in years, that she had nothing prepared to say. Arden's anger rose fast and sharp. She terminated his maintenance contract before the end of that same day, effective immediately, no severance, no explanation offered to the rest of the staff. Word spread through the facility within hours. And more than one employee quietly wondered why a man who had never caused a single problem had suddenly been let go without warning. Celeste found out within hours and confronted her mother in a conversation that quickly became the loudest argument the two of them had ever had inside those walls. Celeste accused her mother of trying to control every choice in her life, of treating love the same way she treated a hostile takeover, something to be neutralized before it could threaten her position. "I am protecting you," Arden said, her voice tight. "No," Celeste answered. "You are protecting your reputation." The words hung in the air between them. Neither willing to take them back, Maddox left the building quietly that afternoon, collecting nothing but his tools and a single folder he had kept locked in his work locker for months. Before he disappeared entirely, he found a way to get a small drive into Celeste's hands, delivered through a mutual contact rather than in person, along with a short handwritten note that gave her only one instruction. "Do not open this until you are ready to know the truth about your mother," the note read. Celeste held the drive for 2 full days before her curiosity finally won. Alone in her apartment, late one night, she inserted it into her laptop and watched an old video file begin to play, grainy footage clearly transferred from something much older, showing her mother decades younger, standing beside a man Celeste had never once seen in any photograph, any record, any conversation, her entire life. The footage revealed a version of Arden that Celeste had never known existed. Long before Veiled Dominion became the empire it was now, Arden had run the company alongside its true original founder, a man named Elias Rowan. In the recording, the two of them stood in front of an unfinished office building, laughing about a future they were building together, equal partners in every sense that mattered at the time. Elias, Celeste realized with a chill spreading through her chest, was Maddox's father. According to the footage and the documents attached alongside it, Elias had once been Arden's closest business partner, the person who had believed in her ambition before anyone else did. Then, following a bitter dispute over ownership rights that the video only partially explained, Elias vanished from the company entirely, leaving Arden to take full control of everything they had built together. Maddox, Celeste now understood, had grown up entirely in the shadow of that disappearance, raised on fragments of a story no one had ever fully told him. Celeste confronted Maddox as soon as she could find him, meeting him at a small park near his son's school, the only place she knew he would agree to see her. His son was there that afternoon too, chasing a soccer ball across the grass with 2 other kids from his class, and Maddox kept one eye on him even while giving Celeste his full attention. She asked him directly whether he had approached her deliberately, whether their entire relationship had been calculated from the start. Maddox did not deny that his father's history had brought him into contact with Veiled Dominion in the first place. "There was a time I thought I wanted to take back everything that should have been mine," he admitted quietly, watching a group of children play across the field. "And now?" Celeste asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Maddox turned to face her fully. "Now I just want to know what my father actually did," he said. And there was nothing rehearsed in the way he said it. Celeste believed him, though belief did not erase the tangle of questions still sitting between them. Together, cautiously, they began piecing apart what had really happened all those years ago. Working from documents Maddox had spent years quietly gathering whenever he could find an opening. What they eventually uncovered stunned them both. Elias had never betrayed Arden. He had never stolen from the company or broken the trust between them the way the official story had always claimed. Someone else entirely had manufactured the evidence that destroyed his reputation and drove him out. Someone who had remained inside Veiled Dominion's leadership ever since, someone who had spent 19 years benefiting from a lie no one had ever thought to question. Maddox and Celeste continued their investigation in secret, meeting late at night, cross-referencing old financial records against documents Maddox had preserved from his father's private files. The trail eventually led them to Dorian Kessler, the company's longtime chief financial officer, a man Arden had trusted almost as completely as she had once trusted Elias. Dorian, it turned out, had spent years manipulating internal reports, quietly siphoning funds through accounts disguised behind layers of departmental codes similar to the ones Maddox had first noticed on the maintenance servers weeks earlier. It had been Dorian who fabricated the evidence, convincing Arden that Elias had embezzled company funds. After Elias left in disgrace, Dorian slowly built influence over a network of smaller shareholders, positioning himself as the second most powerful figure inside the company, without ever drawing the kind of attention his ambitions deserved. He was careful, deliberate, and patient in a way few people in the building ever noticed, always offering to handle the tedious financial details no one else wanted to review closely. Maddox had suspected something like this for years, but suspicion without proof meant nothing against a man who had spent nearly 2 decades covering his tracks with remarkable patience. Maddox had first grown suspicious of Dorian long before he ever took the maintenance contract, back when he was still a teenager piecing together why his father had vanished from every conversation in their house. His mother rarely spoke about the company after Elias left, and what little she did say always circled back to a single unanswered question: why a man who loved his work more than almost anything else would simply walk away from it without a fight. Taking the contractor position had never been random. It had been the only way Maddox could get close enough to the truth to finally answer that question for himself. Dorian noticed the investigation before Maddox and Celeste were ready to act. He struck first, planting falsified records, suggesting that Maddox had stolen sensitive corporate data during his brief time as a contractor. It was a small enough fabrication to seem believable, timed precisely enough to reach Arden before either Maddox or Celeste could bring her anything solid of their own. The forged evidence reached Arden within days, reigniting every suspicion she had originally held about Maddox's intentions toward her daughter. She read the fabricated report and felt something close to vindication, certain now that her instincts about the man had been correct all along, even as the truth sat buried just beneath the surface. Celeste found herself trapped between 2 people she loved, unable to convince her mother of a truth she herself was still only beginning to understand. Dorian used the chaos to his advantage, pressuring Arden to sign off on a major transfer of voting shares under the guise of stabilizing the company during what he called an unusual period of internal risk. If the transfer succeeded, Arden would lose meaningful control over the very company she had spent her life building, though she would not realize the danger until it was almost too late. Dorian visited Arden's office twice that week, each time carrying a folder of his own, thinner than the one Maddox had assembled, but polished enough to look convincing under pressure. He spoke calmly about risk exposure and shareholder confidence, using language Arden had heard from him for 19 years, without ever once questioning it. He mentioned, almost in passing, that men like Maddox often appeared during moments of vulnerability, and Arden absorbed the comment without realizing how carefully it had been planted. She trusted him the way people trust furniture that has never moved, never squeaked, never given them a reason to look underneath it. Security escorted Maddox from the building a second time, this encounter far colder than the first. As guards walked him toward the exit, he turned back one final time and looked directly at Arden standing near the elevators. "Tomorrow you will understand exactly why I never needed your money," he said, his voice calm despite the circumstances. Arden watched him disappear through the doors, uncertain whether what she felt was anger or the first flicker of doubt she had allowed herself in weeks. That brings the story back to the night the ballroom doors opened, and everything collided at once. Arden had walked into her own event, already carrying weeks of suspicion, weeks of fabricated evidence, weeks of a narrative Dorian had carefully constructed to keep her exactly where he wanted her. Seeing Celeste, standing beside Maddox again, after everything, felt to Arden like confirmation of every fear Dorian had planted in her mind. She assumed the entire relationship had been an elaborate scheme from the very beginning. Several guests, sensing the tension, allowed themselves small cruelties disguised as jokes. One man near the bar asked loudly enough for half the room to hear whether Maddox truly believed he could become part of the Vale family. A woman beside him laughed and added that some people would do anything to climb higher than they belonged. Maddox said nothing in response. Celeste stepped forward instead, positioning herself beside him without hesitation, daring anyone else in the room to say something else. Arden ordered security to remove him a third time, her voice sharper now, edged with something closer to desperation than authority. Maddox reached into his jacket and placed the same worn folder on the nearest table, the one he had carried with him for months, waiting for exactly this moment. He told Arden that everything happening in that room tonight, the whispers, the humiliation, the accusations, none of it mattered compared to what she was about to read. Arden hesitated only a moment before opening it fully this time, turning past the first pages toward everything that came after. Inside were copies of the original ownership transaction from 19 years earlier. Elias's authentic signature preserved alongside the forged version Dorian had used to frame him. There were bank records showing the exact accounts Dorian had used to redirect company funds. There were internal emails, transfer logs, and financial statements that together painted a picture no honest accountant could dispute. Arden stood frozen at the table, the noise of the party fading around her as she absorbed exactly how thoroughly she had been deceived. She realized, with a weight that seemed to settle into her chest all at once, that she had spent 19 years distrusting the wrong man entirely. Every guarded instinct she prided herself on, every careful calculation that had built her reputation as untouchable, had been built on top of a lie she never once thought to question. At the very back of the folder sat one final page, a small audio device tucked into a plastic sleeve. With a short note in handwriting Arden recognized instantly, despite not having seen it in nearly 2 decades. "If Arden is hearing this," the note read, "then I failed to protect her the way I meant to." Arden stared at the words for a long moment, her thumb tracing the edge of the plastic sleeve, as if touching it might somehow change what was recorded inside. Her hands shook as she pressed play, and Elias Rowan's voice filled the small space around her for the first time in 19 years. The recording played through a small speaker Maddox had brought along specifically for this moment, and Arden listened as her former partner's voice, older than she remembered it, older than the version frozen in the video Celeste had watched days earlier, explained everything he had never gotten the chance to say. Elias described discovering Dorian's embezzlement scheme shortly before his own departure from the company, describing the exact accounts and transfers Maddox and Celeste had since independently confirmed on their own. Elias explained that he had planned to bring the evidence directly to Arden, certain she would believe him once she saw the numbers laid out clearly. But Dorian had moved faster, manufacturing evidence against Elias himself before he ever had the chance to expose the real scheme. Faced with a fabricated case he could not immediately disprove, and unwilling to drag Arden through a public scandal that might destroy everything she had built, Elias made the decision to walk away entirely rather than fight a battle he feared would cost her more than it cost him. Arden had spent 19 years believing her closest partner had betrayed her without warning. The truth was almost unbearable in its opposite meaning. He had not betrayed her at all. He had sacrificed his own name, his own career, his own place in the story of the company they built together, specifically to protect her from a danger he could not yet prove. She thought of every year she had spent hardening herself against the memory of him, every meeting where she had told younger executives never to trust a partner too completely, every lesson she believed she had learned from a man who, it turned out, had taught her nothing of the kind. For the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, Arden Vale's composure broke completely. Tears rising before she could stop them, her famous control dissolving in front of every guest who had come to celebrate rather than witness this. No one in the ballroom moved. The band, sensing without being told that the evening had shifted into something no music could accompany, quietly stopped playing. Waiters froze near the kitchen doors, trays balanced and forgotten. Celeste watched her mother, a woman she had rarely seen cry even in private, standing exposed in front of 200 guests, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in weeks. She turned toward Maddox, her voice raw, in a way it had never been in any boardroom. "Why did you not bring this to me sooner?" she asked. Maddox held her gaze steadily. "Because it took me years to believe you would actually listen," he said, and the sentence struck her harder than anything Dorian had ever manufactured against him. Celeste moved to her mother's side without a word, offering no argument, no vindication, simply her presence, and somehow that silence said more than anything either of them could have spoken aloud. Arden understood, standing there in front of everyone, that her daughter had chosen well. Not because Maddox possessed wealth, because he clearly did not seek it, not because he carried influence, because he had spent years deliberately avoiding it. He had chosen instead to stay quiet long enough to uncover the truth properly, to protect his father's memory without destroying anyone in the process, to wait patiently for the exact right moment, rather than seeking revenge the instant he had the power to take it. That restraint, Arden realized, said more about his character than any resume ever could. Before the moment could settle into anything resembling peace, Dorian Kessler stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his expression carefully arranged into outrage rather than fear. He announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear that the entire folder was fabricated, that Maddox had assembled a convincing forgery, purely to manipulate Arden and seize a place inside the family and the company both. Several guests, uncertain what to believe, began murmuring among themselves again, the fragile clarity of the previous minutes threatening to collapse under the weight of Dorian's confidence. Arden turned toward Maddox, searching his face for any hint of doubt. Maddox did not raise his voice to match Dorian's. He simply said that he had no authority to decide who was telling the truth, that the decision belonged to Arden and to the evidence itself rather than to anyone's word alone. He then produced a second device from his jacket, a backup drive containing archived server records, pulled from an old system Veil Dominion had long since replaced but never fully wiped, records Maddox had quietly preserved during his months working in the building's lower levels. The data on the drive left no room for interpretation. It traced, transaction by transaction, the exact path Dorian had used to funnel company funds into accounts registered under names that led back, through several careful layers, directly to him. Dorian's expression finally cracked as the numbers appeared clearly enough for even the guests standing nearby to understand what they were looking at. He had no argument left strong enough to counter what the data showed in plain, undeniable terms. Arden turned to her legal team, standing nearby exactly as they always did at her events, and gave the order to freeze every account and access credential associated with Dorian Kessler immediately. Dorian tried once more to argue, his voice climbing toward panic now that composure had failed him, but no one in the room offered him anything to hold on to. Security escorted him from the ballroom within minutes, his protests growing fainter as the doors closed behind him, and the room he left behind fell into a silence deeper than any that had come before it that night. Arden turned back to Maddox once the noise had settled. "I once believed you came here to take something that belonged to my family," she said quietly. Maddox met her eyes without hesitation. "I came here to find something that belonged to my father," he answered. Arden studied him a moment longer before asking the question that had been sitting underneath everything else all along. "What do you want now?" she asked. Maddox glanced briefly at Celeste before answering, his voice steady, quiet enough that only those closest could hear it clearly. "I want to be treated like a person," he said. And the sentence settled over the room like the final note of a long piece of music, finally allowed to rest. Arden crossed the remaining distance between them and did something none of the guests watching had ever seen her do in public, not once in over 20 years of galas, mergers, and carefully managed appearances. She apologized to him directly, not as the chief executive of a company worth billions of dollars, but as a mother who had let fear and old wounds dictate decisions that never should have belonged to her in the first place. She admitted, in front of everyone present, that she had judged him entirely by his position rather than his character, that she had tried to use money to solve a problem that had nothing to do with money at all. She admitted that fear had guided far too many of her decisions over the years, fear of being deceived again the way she believed Elias had once deceived her, fear that had ultimately caused her to misjudge the one man who had spent nearly 2 decades quietly protecting the truth rather than exploiting it. She acknowledged, finally, that she had wronged Elias Rowan in ways she could never fully undo, and that the debt she owed his memory now extended to his son standing in front of her. She said his name slowly, deliberately, as though speaking it aloud after so many years might begin to repair some of the damage her silence had caused. Guests who had come that evening expecting nothing more than champagne and quiet networking found themselves witnessing something none of them would forget, a woman known across the industry for never once admitting fault, standing in the middle of her own celebration and doing exactly that. A few of them exchanged glances, unsure whether to look away out of respect or keep watching out of something closer to admiration. Turning to face the full room, Arden announced clearly that Maddox Rowan was not the opportunist so many of them had assumed him to be that evening. He was, in fact, the man responsible for uncovering an internal scheme that had nearly cost the company control of itself. A scheme that had gone unnoticed for 19 years until his patients finally exposed it. The same guests who had laughed at him an hour earlier now stood silent, several of them lowering their eyes rather than meeting his. She offered him a position as a strategic partner within the company on the spot, a role with real authority, real influence. Everything the room had assumed he wanted all along. Maddox declined immediately, without a moment of hesitation. "I do not need a title to prove my worth," he said simply. Arden allowed herself something rare in front of an audience, a genuine smile. "Then, for the first time in my life," she said, "I am going to make an offer without expecting to buy the answer I want." The two of them spoke quietly for a few more minutes, while the rest of the room slowly returned to something resembling normal conversation, though no one that night would forget what they had just witnessed. Maddox eventually agreed to work alongside the company in a more limited capacity, but only on the condition that employee protections and full financial transparency became permanent priorities moving forward. Terms Arden accepted without negotiation for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. Celeste stood beside him through all of it, and no one in that room dared laugh again. Somewhere near the back, the same man who had joked earlier about Maddox becoming part of the family now found somewhere else to look entirely. Arden looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and asked a question she had never once thought to ask throughout the entire relationship. She did not ask what Maddox owned or what he could offer the family. She asked simply whether Celeste was happy. Celeste smiled. The first fully unguarded smile she had allowed herself all evening, and answered with a single word that carried more weight than any contract Arden had ever signed. "Yes," she said. Maddox and Celeste eventually made their way toward the ballroom exit together, leaving the noise and the recovering guests behind them. A few guests began speaking again in low voices, though the conversation in the room had changed entirely, no longer about scandal or gossip, but about the quiet dignity of the man they had mocked only an hour earlier. Arden remained near the table where everything had unfolded, watching them go, the check she had once tried to hand Maddox still sitting untouched, exactly where it had been left weeks earlier during their private meeting. She picked it up slowly, studied it for a long moment under the low light of the room, and then tore it cleanly in half. She let the pieces fall into a nearby waste bin without a second glance, turning instead toward the doors her daughter had just walked through, choosing for the first time in years to follow rather than to control. Outside, the night air was cool, and Celeste stood waiting near the entrance with Maddox beside her. Neither of them speaking. Both of them simply breathing in the quiet after everything that had just happened. Somewhere down the street, the city carried on exactly as it always had, indifferent to what had just unraveled inside one glittering room. Arden stepped through the doors a moment later, and for the first time that evening, no one in her presence needed to brace themselves for what she might say next. A person's worth was never written on a bank statement, a title, or the name attached to a family fortune. Sometimes the one every room is quick to dismiss turns out to be the only one brave enough to speak the truth out loud.